I wanted to talk about the mother wound before I kind of go down a whole series on parents. Parents who have disorders and difficulties and traumas related to often narcissistic behavior, untreated borderline behavior, often called emotionally immature patterns. I really think that this is a place where everything we talk about when it comes back to attachment and patterns and all of that, the origin story, I should say, is really about what happens to us initially, at least in a significant part, alongside genetics and other environmental traumas and stories and biology, is really though about the world we enter from the primary caregiving perspective. And across, I believe, most cultures, most parts of the world, more often than not, that person is a mother in some capacity or supposed to be a mother. So let's talk about the impact of the mother wound, and each video that follows this next week will be in support of the mother wound and go further into explaining kind of what it looks like and what it does to us. And so today we're talking about the legacy of the mother wound as the first video. Coco is at it again. Coco, hold please. Hey, I love you so much, but we're not doing that right. And I'm back. So the first thing that's important to understand, we're talking about, like I said, the kinds of mothers who would historically be what we classify as emotionally immature, narcissistic, untreated borderline, disorders where their trauma or their genetics. And please know that though we do know there's a large percentage of a lot of things we struggle with that seem to be related to varying forms of trauma, from, single event traumas to clearly relational repeated traumas, often at the hands of caregivers. The bottom line is that no matter where it comes from or why or how, not necessarily, not everything may be trauma related, though the research does support a large percentage. You have to hold space for that. Some things may or may not be a certain way because of a person's own difficulties, own story, genetic or otherwise, right? So I just want to say that, but it's important to acknowledge. And the reason why I say that is because in my own story, for example, with my father, my non-biological father, who I thought was my father for most of my life, he definitely had a very clearly, extremely traumatic childhood. And yet my mom, identifiably outside of her own story, when I looked at her childhood, it doesn't come anywhere close. And there are stories about her being this way even as a little girl from her brothers. And so this is why I want to just make space for saying, we just don't know everything about everything. And so just hold in your mind that your parent may not have had what seems to be or one you're aware of a trauma. That doesn't disregard that they had narcissism or untreated borderline, or that you suffered, just because you can't necessarily say, oh, they had this wound. But of course, it's extremely likely that they have their own traumas, their own stories, their own struggles, and that unfortunately the lack of self-awareness and understanding and parenting that they didn't really have got in the way. At the same time, none of that excuses certain behaviors. And so I don't think it takes anywhere near any kind of degree to say that certain behaviors and things were hurtful and not okay. Because not all parents are mentally, physically, emotionally wounding to their children just because of their generation. That being said, okay. So the first thing is that we often learn about what love looks like as a result of these caregiving behaviors. We learn about love at home. And so this mother wound, this mother love, and once again, make no mistake, all mothers are imperfect. We are all going to screw up. We're all going to have our own traumas and stories get in the way. But as we move down the line of it becoming more and more impactful, if the love was generally not consistent and safe, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the time your mom or the times you blew up and lost it. I'm talking about the patterns. Although we do know that even something like that, depending upon the circumstances, can create a trauma for a child. It's just that the repeated nature of relational trauma tends to be where we see the greatest impact, because we often see a lack of repairs, a lack of changing the behavior and things like that. So we learn about love at home. So this love, this root of this wound, takes place from the moment we arrive in the world, from how the caregiver is responding to us. And some parents might be great when kids are little, but not when older. Some might always feel burdened. Some might be great and they go through their own stories and struggles. But just think of that nest, the nest that you land in, the temperature, the climate, I would say, of that nest might actually begin to shape a lot about what happens to you. The next thing is that you learn to understand your value in that nest, in that home. And so a child who is more often attended to, even though I think we all struggle with some degrees of worthlessness or worthiness in general because of the world we live in and the culture we live in, the value of love itself. Is love safe? Is it reliable? Do I have to live in constant fight or flight? Do I have to shut down completely? So that value starts to emerge in the nest. The next thing is that as a result of what happens in that nest, if it is a wounding, priming experience, that many of us leave that nest with this mother wound feeling confused, empty, having a really distorted sense of self, but not really knowing it, because that nest was often the only nest we ever knew. And so that's where it becomes difficult. That's what starts to set us up alongside the taboo often of talking badly about moms and mothers that can make it really, really confusing. And so we don't know that a lot of what happened in that wound in that nest may be related to our parents. We just know that we don't feel great about ourselves, or we don't feel worthy. And so we blame ourselves. And that often is what kind of is happening for us throughout the course of our lives, until we begin to understand the nature of trauma or genetics or disorders, but the core until we understand this mother wound, that there was something that happened to us, that there's an unhealed, ongoing wound inside that doesn't ever seem to scab over, never seems to heal. If it starts to heal a little bit, something always happens that brings us back to the wound. And so basically we tell ourselves it has to be our fault because it can't possibly be this mother that we've been told is this sacrificial, glorified human being. And so that no matter what happens, we start to believe that it's our fault, because if it was their fault, if the mother's fault, it was her fault, and she cared about us, or it wasn't our fault, or we were worthy enough, certainly she would have not talked to us that way, abandoned us, made those decisions, done those things to us. And so that kind of reinforces the nature of, well, it can't be her, it must be me. So often we're living with this mother wound. We have a deep sense of loss and grief and deprivation, and it manifests not only in how we deal with ourselves and our distorted sense of self, our inner critic, it plays out in the repetition of toxic relationships. It manifests in mental and physical health conditions. It's almost like whack-a-mole. The core wound is the mother wound, but it pops up in all these other places, and it almost distracts us. Oh, it's that bad partner. Oh, it's that bad boss. Oh, it's that thing I should have done differently. And oftentimes we're really avoiding the one sense of the core, which really is about the mother wound. And this is especially true when your mother wasn't always bad. So as I've talked about, I think it's even more confusing. So if you had a very classically narcissistic, no mirroring kind of mother, eventually at some point, I think you start to go, God, she's just like so much worse than other people, but she's still your mother. So that makes it complicated. But then if you add in layers of, well, oh, she was great here and helpful there and really wounding here, more cat hairs always when I'm talking, it just gets more and more confusing. And so once again, between society and the culture and you're blaming yourself, you often don't think that there even is a mother wound. And that is sometimes one of the first things we uncover, sometimes in therapy, is that, and obviously there are other types of wounds. I saw really quickly a TikTok talking about, when you have this kind of wound, the mother wound, and this kind of wound, the father wound. And it's like, yes, I get that. But the bottom line to me is that as a result of the wound, whoever that person was, what really is wounded is you. And so it's like almost like the wound is about not even as much about them or who they were or they weren't, but about the versions of yourself that you had to create, hide, medicate, neglect, wound, shame, whatever, to manage the wound that exists in the first place. So that brings us to the whole point of this video, which is there's often a legacy of wound that occurs. There's a legacy of the constant criticism, a legacy of the needing to reinforce that we're not good enough and not worthy, There's a constant self-sabotage that occurs. I just got a package. I'm gonna let that play out. That's my camera. So basically the bottom line is this legacy is the wound. And the legacy is basically that it's too much to look at the wound from her, and so it must be us. And it plays out in a lack of feeling lovable, a lack of feeling worthy, believing that love is conditional. I'm going to talk more about this in other videos. But this is the legacy of the mother wound that's so important to understand, is that so much of it is almost like uncovering a secret for many people. Even if they are classically narcissistic, at some point you don't even, that's all you know. You might say, oh, my friends' moms aren't quite that way. But not until you fully become aware at some point. And it takes a while for many people. We're discussing it so much now in the media, I think that helps. But the hard part is, even though you know up here, oh, it's her, right? Now we're learning about narcissism or untreated borderline or immaturity. The problem is the wound exists and lives inside of you. And the hardest part is to understand and separate that wound that you're holding inside is initially and originally not your wound to carry. It is not the wound you created, but it has become like who you are. And so separating that and identifying the mother wound is why I think it's so imperative to your healing, to at least be able to begin with saying, you know what, I didn't create this, it's not my fault, that all these things I've believed about myself are not true. And how you heal and change that is a journey. It is often a lifelong process. You can't spend a large part of the most formative years of your life having these kind of relationships with her or him, whoever they are, and not believe that, yeah, I know it's them, but no, it's really me. I am the wound. I am wounded, and there's something wrong with me that I will always be wounded. That is the legacy of the mother wound we want to work on. So thank you for being here. Please stay safe and well. And please feel free to check out the courses I've created specifically on these issues. I'll talk more. This course is called Borderline and Narcissistic Parents, Healing and Dealing with Your Trauma. And I have another course called Remothered, about trying to learn to reparent the inner child, to remother yourself, because you are both the inner parent and the inner child. So thank you for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.